Welcome back to An Acquired Taste. In this episode, I'm going to talk about why behavior is more important than experience when hiring for your startup. Founders tend to get very excited when they find an opportunity to hire the former Google employee, the former Apple employee, the former Microsoft employee, believing that that pedigree will somehow propel them into success in their own startup. But 9 times out of 10, those folks leave or are fired within the first 6 months. In my experience, that's the case. Why is that? Well, because it wasn't a fit. At the end of the day, there's nothing that resembles Google at your startup. From the pay to the perks to the culture, to the fact that you guys are probably still emptying your own trash cans, nothing between you and Google or Apple or Microsoft or one of these mega companies is the same. Employees at startups, early stage startups, are expected to be individual contributors, working autonomously and being accountable for a wide swath of responsibilities. That's not really the case in these bigger companies. Their area of focus is probably more narrow. They are part of bigger teams. Their success or failure is really an offshoot of the total ecosystem of people and systems and processes and interrelated products and, for that matter, marketing and shareholder meetings and all these other things. None of that stuff is the case for you at your startup as a founder. So hiring that former Microsoft engineer as the kind of the trophy hire, maybe that's the case, maybe not, but talent acquisition at the end of the day is about fit and fit between the employee and the company itself. So the expectations of the employee for what they are, or the potential employee for what they are going to do, and the company's expectation for what success for that employee's performance looks like. Those two things have to fit. Resumes, or what I refer to as experiential hiring, so looking at somebody's resume, looking at somebody's past experience and making a judgment or a set of assumptions based on that to say they're likely to be successful in this role, is fundamentally flawed. And it's fundamentally flawed for what I just talked about, which is it's almost impossible for any company. I used an extreme example from Google to your early stage startup, but even startup to startup at the same stage, founder to founder, those cultures are going to be different. Those expectations are going to be different. The stage of the product is going to be different. And so looking at somebody's experience somewhere else and assuming that that experience is going to lend itself to your company is flawed logic. So I'm going to quote Dr. Andy Goldblatt, who was the person who really taught me this concept, or taught me the idea around behavioral interviewing and focusing on past behaviors. But he has a quote, or at least I will quote him as as the source of this, which is, past behavior is the best predictor of future performance. And in simplest terms, how you behave is more hardwired than what you have done. So if what you have done is your experience, but how you behave is how you act, and how you have acted in the past is more likely to be how you will act in the future. Now we're talking about looking at past behaviors and future behaviors for you potentially hiring this person. Will those behaviors that they have demonstrated in the past be successful behaviors moving forward in your organization? So many of you out there may be familiar with the concept of behavioral interviewing. That's the kind of interview where somebody asks you to, quote unquote, tell them a story about a specific thing that happened to you in the past. So it could be, it could start with like, tell me about a time when, or when you have had this happen to you in the past, what did you do? What was the outcome? Those are behavioral interview questions. But a lot of people may be familiar with that style, but don't actually know why you're asking those questions. And again, it goes back to how somebody has behaved in the past is most likely how they're going to behave in the future. And if that past behavior meets your expectations for what successful behaviors look like in your organization, you're far more likely to hire a candidate that is a fit that I mentioned earlier. So how do you do that? I'm going to give you an example for a sales candidate. So let's say, for example, in your organization, you have to have a lot of high touch or a lot of contacts at, let's say, the top of the funnel, at the very beginning of the sales process. You're going to need somebody who's very persistent and potentially very creative. Because if you have somebody who just goes in there and emails them once and gives up, that's not going to work. If you have somebody who emails the same email message 15 times, that's also not going to work. So you're trying to screen for some attributes, and I'm going to circle back to attributes in a second as kind of the foundation of all of this. You're looking for persistence. You're also looking for creativity. So a question that would get to that attribute to examine past behaviors, I would ask a question like, tell me about a time when you were trying to reach a new sales prospect that wasn't returning your emails or phone calls or your contact attempts. What did you do and what was the outcome? That's a way to get to what exactly did you do from a persistence perspective. It also might get into a little bit of how they were creative in that process as opposed to just repeating themselves over and over again. Persistence, creativity are what we would call attributes. Attributes are what you're actually screening for. And when you look at a successful candidate, there's two ways to kind of decide what attributes you're looking for. One is, do I already have somebody in this role that's successful? Okay, let's reverse engineer that. What behaviors does that candidate or does that employee demonstrate that likely makes them successful? I want to replicate that. So if this person is persistent, this person is creative, right? This person is adaptable, this person is competitive. Those become the attributes I want to screen for because I already know that employees that have those attributes are successful, so I want more of them. Let's say this is a first-time hire. You haven't hired for this role before. You have no idea what those attributes are likely to be. Look at what's required of somebody going into that role to be successful. I gave you the example of the salesperson. Let me give you an example of a product manager. So a product manager hiring for the first time, you recognize that in your organization, things move quickly. You make decisions, and then based on the customer feedback, based on market feedback, you change rapidly. Okay, well, maybe we're getting back into that adaptability attribute that I mentioned before. For a product manager, they have to be adaptable. They have to be adaptable to the organization. They have to be adaptable to the feedback of the market. So now I'm screening for those things. And then you can add more attributes based on that. So a couple of key ones. I talked about adaptability. I talked about competitiveness. I talked also to need for achievement. You know, that's not to be mistaken with competitiveness. And what I mean by that is competitiveness is I love the fight. I love the struggle. I love to strive for this thing. And then the outcome is the outcome, right? Whereas need for achievement is I may like that, I may not like that, but I want to win. That at the end of the day, I want to be successful. And that need for achievement is something that's going to drive a person. Those are three attributes that are kind of cornerstone. And you can build off of those, or you could decide that those aren't that important for whatever role you're hiring. But look at those attributes. That's what you're keying in for. So how do you do this? First, you can Google behavioral interview questions, and you'll get hundreds of good, high quality questions. Three things that every question should have in a behavioral interview is background, action, result. You can call them a bar story. It's very basic storytelling, right? But you want to know the background. So what was the context of the situation for the question you're asking? Again, if I go back to the sales example, tell me about a time when you weren't getting a response from a sales prospect, right? Well, what's the background, right, of that story? Who was it? What were you trying to sell? Where were you at the time? That's your background. What actions did they take? This is important because it can't be something that just happened to them. They had to have done something, demonstrated a behavior or set of behaviors that then produced a result, which is the R of the bar story. So bar story, background, action, result. As long as it has those three things, it's probably a decent question or at least a decent place to start. Get 2 questions for each attribute you're screening for, because ultimately, if you can, get 2 different people to interview for the same attributes, but each person asks a different one of those questions. So the set of A questions I may ask, and then the set of B questions, maybe I ask a coworker, a co-founder, somebody else in my organization who knows how to do behavioral interviews, or at least I have I'm confident that they will do a good job in a behavioral interview. Have them ask the B questions, or the second set of questions for each attribute, and then circle back and debrief and decide, what did you hear? What did they hear? Do we think we have a demonstration of behaviors that are going to more than likely create a fit? To give you an example of why this is important, why this works, why this is preferable over experiential hiring, I did this in an organization, and again, I'll go back to Dr. Goldblatt. He basically installed this process into our service-based company. We went from 110% annualized turnover. I'm going to pause there. 110%. We were turning over the mathematical equivalent of 110% of our staff every year. Incredibly expensive, incredibly time-consuming, incredibly destructive to the bottom line. In just over a year, about 18 months, we went to 35%, 36% if memory serves. So 110% churn to 36% churn. Now you might say 36% churn is high, but in this particular industry, in this service sector, 36% would have been best in class by some real margin. So this works. Bonus to all of this is that your talent pipeline now grows exponentially. If you're experientially hiring for someone or some position, you're going to be looking for certain job titles. You're going to be looking for certain past job experiences. And that's going to narrow your field of view. And the fact of the matter is, you have no idea if those behaviors exist just based on that resume. So start thinking about what attributes are most likely to be displayed in other types of jobs, in other environments, in other companies. One of the best examples I can give you is I hired somebody to do contract sales within commercial landscaping. Very specific, right? This person previously had the background of a pastry chef for a very high-end restaurant. And you would think, well, those two things have absolutely nothing in common unless you break it down to the attributes. And I tell this story all the time, but if you look at what makes a pastry chef successful, attention to detail. They are self-reliant, because usually there's only one pastry chef in the entire restaurant. They are competitive. They want that thing to come out and it looks perfect. It's the last thing that somebody sees in a meal. They probably just paid a lot of money for that meal. That has to go out and has to be perfect, and it has to matter to that person. And at the end of the day, you will see a lot of James Beard awards being, awarded to pastry chefs. It's a lot of competition out there. So there's a bunch of attributes in there that would lend themselves to a lot of other roles, happen to lend itself very well to this contractual sales role. She ended up being our most successful salesperson by a large margin, millions of dollars in sales annualized in that role. And if you looked at it only or specifically from a resume standpoint, you would have never made that connection. And that would have been a huge missed opportunity for us and for our organization. So I hope that's helpful. I hope you guys get a chance to take a look at some behavioral questions, and maybe this improves your talent funnel. Maybe this improves your fit. Maybe this reduces employee churn. But I definitely recommend taking a hard look at this. As always, thanks for tuning in. Like, comment, and subscribe, and we'll see you next time.